we can get started. I don't see anyone else waiting in the meeting room. So let us get this going. So thank you everyone for joining us on this Monday evening. We're really happy to have you with our first ever Truth Talks tonight. We hope to do more of these in the future. So if you like it, please let us know at the end. We'll send out a survey tomorrow as well if you want to send the feedback to us in a more formal way. Some ground rules throughout the panel and the Q&A. We're going to do 45 minutes or so of moderated panel conversation where Charlie will ask Kelly, Letícia, and Selin some questions, and then in the end, we'll leave around 15 minutes for question and answer. Please also note that we are recording this event. If you have any tech issues, you can message me in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to assist you. That is all from me, and now I'll pass it on to our moderator for tonight, Charlie Sennott, the founder, CEO, and editor at GroundTruth.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for coming. This is a really wonderful mix of friends and family and supporters. And I hope it's just a way to say a really personal thank you to each of you. Every person on this call in some incredible way has been a supporter, an advisor, a funder. And we don't get enough chance to say thank you in person. We try to do it by email. We try to do it through the newsletter that Lauren very thoughtfully puts together all the time. But there's nothing like sort of a virtual eye-to-eye conversation and a chance to share the kind of work we do, and most importantly, to share the kind of unbelievably talented new generation of journalists that we get to work with all the time. And you're gonna have a chance to meet three really incredible journalists who we work with very closely. And I wanted to just sort of frame this by saying, you know, we're here to honor World Press Freedom Day. It was marked yesterday on May 3rd. But World Press Freedom Day has always been a time for us to sort of recognize the importance of a free press in our world and the need for truth in a time where it feels like we often live in a post-truth world. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about what does it mean to see the erosion of truth happening in so many corners of our world and even in our own country. And how do we deal with that? How do we equip a new generation of journalists to really be ready to confront that challenge and hold up the great mission of journalism and truth-telling? And you know, I think we come into this coronavirus understanding this is a global pandemic, but I've never felt like we needed more trusted local news. So there's a real connection for us here as an organization that does both global work and local journalism. So most of you know GroundTruth does international fellowships around the world, and I'll tell you, two of our reporters on the call today will be examples of that. But we also support Report for America, which is really supporting local reporting in America. We just announced 225 reporters in 164 newsrooms across America doing the service of local reporting in their respective communities. And it's a really exciting program, but we like to think of ourselves as constantly toggling between that global and local expression of journalism. So it just feels like right now in this moment, trusted journalism's never felt more vital, but it's also never felt more at risk. And we want to talk about the peril that journalists face. We know the conventional front lines that journalists face. We were really, you know, deeply impacted, changed forever by the death of a colleague, Jim Foley, who was murdered in Syria. Jim was up against what I would call the more conventional front lines. He was in Syria, he was reporting, he was a very close colleague and a very close friend, and someone who just embodied all of the things we really care about at GroundTruth. He was someone who dedicated his life, risked his life to be there on the ground to tell the story, but he was also a person of tremendous service. He did 2 tours of Teach for America, and we're so inspired by Jim's life, but he was captured in Syria and killed in Syria by ISIS, and it really changed us. It changed how we think about front lines and safety. But there are more front lines in journalism right now than just the conventional front lines of covering a conflict. I think the new front lines, the ones we want to talk about today, have a lot more to do with cyber attacks. They have to do with trolls who come from far right corners of different countries that are really coming after our journalists in extraordinary ways. To call it bullying is just ridiculously light. It's really a whole new version of a hostile environment. We are very proud to support hostile environment training for war zone reporting, but we need more hostile environment training for the kind of cyber attacks that reporters are experiencing these days. And we also have, of course, a very, very new kind of frontline in reporting on a global pandemic. And how do we protect journalists to do that? How do we sort of steel them up for the trauma that can come with reporting on that, but also really practical things on how can you get into a community and report safely in that community with social distancing. So that's the kind of terrain I want to go over. And I want to jump right away into introducing you to our three journalists who we'll be talking to today. So maybe you guys could wave as I introduce you. I'm going to introduce each three, and then I'm going to come back and ask them each a question. And then we're going to turn over to you for your questions for them. The first person is Letícia Duarte, who's in my upper right corner on the gallery. Letícia is a Brazilian journalist. She's extraordinary in the work she's done, but she's really an outstanding journalist in her native Brazil, where she was named one of the top journalists in Brazil. Before she came to Columbia University to go to a graduate program there, she was working already at the highest levels in Brazil and really working in sort of leading news organizations there and doing extraordinary work for which she was greatly recognized. When I first met Letícia, she was just being awarded the Overseas Press Club Fellowship, which is a really distinguished fellowship. And then we really encouraged her to apply for our GroundTruth Fellowship for reporting on a series that was led by Kevin Grant, who's with us, our Chief Content Officer. Kevin led a series called Democracy Undone, which looked at the rise of populist nationalism around the world and how there seems to be almost like a playbook that, that authoritarian figures or nationalists are using in every corner of the world. Letícia brought us that story from her native Brazil, and it was really one of the most extraordinary pieces of reporting that we've had on GroundTruth. It was courageous, and it was groundbreaking, and it was really an important and central part of that series, Democracy Undone. So welcome, Letícia. I could keep going on your profile because there's so much that you've done, but I'm going to stop there and we can weave some in later. The next person I want to introduce is Selin Thomas. Selin is the editor of our series of dispatches that we have every week on GroundTruth, and dispatches are on the ground dispatches from every corner of where we have a Report for America reporter. So we have the Report for America reporters, or core members as we call them. They're out there serving these local communities, telling that story. But we ask them twice a year to file dispatches to us, which are sort of like postcards from the corner of America that they're covering. So these are coming at you from Mississippi, where we had a reporter look at a spike in prison deaths, or from Appalachia, where we saw a real crisis with clean drinking water, lack of clean drinking water for a lot of residents of incredibly poor post-coal corners of West Virginia and Kentucky. We've had pieces from Ohio and from the border in Texas, from Washington State amid the COVID crisis. Really, really an eclectic and beautiful collection and expressions of undercovered corners of our own country. And Selin is the editor of that. She does an amazing job. She comes to us as a journalist who was freelancing, who had gotten her Master of Arts in Political and Global Affairs at Columbia University Journalism School. And she's done pretty extraordinary work in her own right in the field in Burma and in some of the refugee camps along the Turkish border. Her own family is a family of doctors, and also her mom is an artist from Turkey. So she brings a wonderful mix of just a background and a really beautiful complexity to how she edits and brings those narratives forward. And I also want to introduce Kelly Kasulis. Kelly was our digital editor at the GroundTruth Project. Kelly, are you waving? I'm kind of trying to read my note. Yeah, there you are. All right, cool. and Kelly's work is really extraordinary as a freelancer. You know, she was working with us as deputy digital editor at the GroundTruth project, and then she really wanted to go and freelance and went to Seoul, South Korea, where she covers North and South Korean affairs. She does this for print, radio, and television, and she works for organizations like GroundTruth. She still writes for us, but she also writes and does pieces for Bloomberg and Al Jazeera, the BBC. And you may have heard her work on Public Radio International. One extraordinary piece she did was on the delivery men in South Korea and the packages they bring and the incredible inequity in their lives versus a country that's grown to rely on these very precise delivery services. Again, Kelly's bio is similar in that it just goes on, and she's got so many accolades and honors, but I do love that she put in a lot of years working as a fellow with NBC Connecticut, and she did that in partnership with the Emma Bowen Foundation for Minority Interests in Media. So Kelly, thanks for being here and welcome. So those are our three journalists, and I'm going to ask each one a question. We'll try to do these in sort of rapid fire, and then please get your own questions ready, and we'll come to those after we go. Each one will have 2 questions. So Letícia, I wanted to start with you, and I wanted to ask you about what's going on in Brazil. We all know President Bolsonaro is probably one of the most flagrant violators of downplaying the risks of this virus. And if those of you who haven't followed it, it's really an extraordinary thing to watch, just how much Bolsonaro is in denial, even as the virus spreads through all 27 states of Brazil. Bolsonaro's sort of unique brand of populist nationalism came onto the scene in 2019, and he's very much in the spirit of President Trump in terms of, you know, really sort of playing to a populist nationalist crowd. And the coronavirus has given him a stage that's been pretty extraordinary, and frankly, one that I don't totally understand. I don't understand how it serves his purposes to diminish this. I would think he would be worried about his reelection, because if this really gets out of control, it could swamp him. So what Bolsonaro stands to gain in downplaying this puzzles me, and it puts it in the context of how authoritarian governments around the world are exploiting the coronavirus. They're taking the fear and uncertainty that comes with it. They're really trying to tap into that in their constituents and play off it. But explain for us what you think is happening in Brazil with Bolsonaro, and about this weekend in particular, while it was World Press Freedom Day, what was happening in Brazil? What was happening with journalists in Brazil?
Hi guys, thank you for having me. And I think that's such an important moment for Brazil, especially, and for the world, as we are all facing this terrible moment. But in Brazil is really scary, because you are seeing how these authoritarian policies are really killing people. And I think often when you discuss about democracy, it seems so theoretical. Oh, these guys are threatening democracy. It seems like a concept, seems like a rhetoric, seems like something that the presidents are just tweeting. But in Brazil, you are seeing how this is playing on the streets, and how the people are dying because of these policies that is not just cyber attacks anymore. Is like yesterday, to give you an example, yesterday there was like a big protest in Brazil against democracy, and Bolsonaro was on the streets with the protesters. So, and during this protest, this rally, they are in front of imagine like Brazil White House, and they were there, and they're asking for a military intervention to close the Congress, to close the Supreme Court, and to give absolute powers to Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro was with the guys on the streets. And that's such an escalating of the dangers of all this rhetoric. And during this protest, there's journalists that they were covering it, and they were physically attacked. So they are punched, they were kicked, and they had to leave the protest. They're calling the journalists garbage. And that's a really, I think, important to know that's not just one specific moment in Brazil, that's happening every day, and the journalists are being physically attacked during the protest for Bolsonaro supporters with the endorsement of the president, because I think it's kind of similar, the base with when you think about Trump, how is a very similar rhetoric, but in Brazil, that's not on the internet anymore. It's just not about attacking the press, saying, oh, that's fake news. They're really going through journalists physically. And that's a new level of the problems we are facing right now, especially in this moment when all the crises are converging. So right now in Brazil, Bolsonaro is, as Charlie said, he's denying the pandemic, and he says that's not a big deal, and he's encouraging people to just keep their normal lives. And it's similar how Trump started here, but Bolsonaro is still holding this vision. And people say that he's doing that because he doesn't want to pay the price when the economy goes down. He wants to blame the governors. So he's just blaming the governors, saying, and blaming the media too, because Bolsonaro and the science, because Bolsonaro is against the media, is against the science, is against science, and is against the, like, there's the political opponents. So holding this vision, Bolsonaro basically saying, oh, don't trust the media is lying to you. Don't trust the scientists, the science doesn't matter, trust me. So something that's happening and that's really scary, and that they are spreading a lot of fake news against the coronavirus. So probably you guys have seen, there's a lot of photos from Amazon, these mass graves on the land with a lot of coffins and the holes on the land. And that's like a real thing that's happening. But for Bolsonaro supporters, they are spreading fake news saying that's a lie. And all these coffins, instead of having bodies, they say the coffins have the rocks. They say the governors are putting rocks inside the coffins just to pretend that the pandemic was a real issue, but it's not. So again, he's trying to say the media is lying to you. And that's terrible because people are dying because of it. So I think when you think about what that means, attacks on democracy and attacks on the press, in Brazil, that means that people are dying. And it's so surreal what we're having right now. And I'm really glad we're here discussing these issues from different perspectives in different countries, because we have seen in many countries the same patterns are being replicated.
Thanks. Letícia, it's hard to hear this without seeing all of the parallels in our own country. I mean, blaming the governors, attacking the media. And just to give you a little bit of contextualization, Wilson, will you put your hand up for me? Wilson did a beautiful design of a project that we call Authoritarians Playbook, which was part of the Democracy Undone fellowship that Letícia was part of and that Kevin led. But Wilson really designed this Authoritarians Playbook, and I think about it all the time. It is literally as if they are operating off a playbook. And this is happening in Hungary, this is happening in Poland, this is happening in Brazil, and of course, sadly, it's happening in our own country. So it feels like it's really time to pay attention to these patterns. And it's one of the unique perspectives I think we get at GroundTruth is we get very close to the reporters, and we can see the patterns in their reporting and the patterns that are happening. And Letícia, thanks. It's really distressing to hear, but it's really so valuable to have your knowledge from there on the ground. And we'll come back. I want to ask you about Olavo in just a moment. But before we do, Selin, tell us a little bit about your experience reporting in New York City, epicenter of the coronavirus in the United States, a really hard place to report. And I just want to hear a little bit about your own journey as a reporter, your own background, having a family with so many people who are in the medical profession. You know the dangers, you know the perils out there, but you felt very strongly that you wanted to be there on the ground to tell this story, and you wanted to try to get into the field hospitals. It wasn't easy. But talk with us a little bit about how you've navigated that, what you found, and how it's shaped your understanding of the coronavirus.
Yes, well, I guess the first thing comes to mind is I didn't do it very well. I didn't get into the field hospital. And that is a, practical matter of, our governor keeps saying, the thing he keeps asking his children as they grow up is risk, reward. And that's a thing that's playing in my mind as I'm trying to report a story here in New York City, as I'm trying to advise our core members out across the country reporting on this crisis. And as they're dealing with all of the ethical considerations that I also confronted in this brief foray into Central Park, where Samaritan's Purse has set up a field hospital. And I was, curious about the representation of an evangelical organization in the most diverse city in maybe the world, certainly this country, and how people there were being spiritually advised on their deathbeds without their family members near them or able to see them. And it was very difficult. There's a lot of security, tons of barriers. It's the kind of thing where maybe if you had a month, you could just keep going every single day. But of course, every time you step out the door, there's an enormous risk. And so I, conferred with my family, the physicians, and the thing about being from doctors is they don't see things as badly usually as they may be. So it's actually from all of the resources online of journalists, resources and institutional kind of webinars and hearing from people who are out in the field, out in hospitals, that I got the most useful information about PPE, about how to relate to somebody from a distance, from 6 feet away, how to conduct an interview on Zoom, particularly a profile that might, that's the type of thing that you connect with the subject in person, and, you build a rapport that allows you to get the story. And all of this now being thwarted, it's a huge learning curve. And so I think the thing that I really came away with and I'm still working on is the thing that reporters are used to. It's flexibility, and it's the ability to just pivot within a story and to see that, that risk may not be worth that particular reward. And so how do I still get a story? And like you say, I was compelled because it's a strange feeling being in New York City, where this chaos is just outside your door and it's wreaking havoc in the hospitals and the morgues. And my sister is a nurse downtown, and the stories that she told me about the last rites, a nurse reading out the last rites to a patient. That's what got me interested in the Central Park Hospital. So I felt like I had to say something on behalf of my city, but it wasn't the field hospital. So I just shifted gears, and I looked at how different religious communities across the city are coping with the fact that they can't practice their traditional burial rites and methods.
Yeah, Selin, I want to disagree. I think you navigated it really well. I think you went into an understandable wall, which is that you weren't allowed into the field hospital. And sometimes for journalists, it's to listen to the authorities and to accept that. It also was
rarely
to go there. It's worth noting that Selin worked with Dexter Filkins at the New Yorker, and Dexter is one of the great frontline war correspondents, but I think you navigated a completely different battlefield in a completely different way. And you found a really important story about how faith and the role of faith in trying to honor the deaths that are happening. And I hope we can come back to the story of the Imam and how you explored it. Yeah. And we'll try to do that.
If there's anything I learned from Dex, there's always a workaround.
Yeah. Well, he's taught you well, because, like I said, it's a different kind of front line. This is not Afghanistan where Dexter does his work, but this is a front line that's very difficult to navigate. and that I think you did it. I think you did a really great job, and I think you should know that like the way you circumnavigated it safely really matters. One of the things we really deeply believe in at GroundTruth is safety. So for me, the inspiration of Jim Foley's story, which I shared with you at the beginning, is that we have to be like the best we can possibly be at promoting a culture of safety. And we're really proud of that. So whether that's in a hostile environment, in a war zone, or at a field hospital in New York City, it's got to have the same level of safety to it. And I think you handled it really well, really smartly. Kelly, I want to just shift to you now, and I want to say, you know, as someone who's really tried to develop, you know, a career and a livelihood as a freelancer, it's not easy. It's really tough out there, and you've got some great clients, and you're doing great work. But it's one of the greatest values of the kind of work you do as a freelance journalist, that you can tell stories that can have a great reflection on us as Americans. It's almost like holding up a mirror to America and say, look at the rest of the world and compare yourself to how you're doing. One of the stories you did early on that was so important was looking at how South Korea was dealing with the coronavirus compared to how we in the United States were doing, and the relative outcomes as a result. Just share with us a little bit about how you told that story and why it's important.
Yeah, I feel like the coronavirus coverage in Korea has kind of come in waves or phases. In the beginning, there was a whole lot of confusion, right? Because we were the second country to have a major outbreak, the second largest outbreak outside of China. So we were kind of like a ground zero zone when doctors still didn't really understand this virus. Granted, they still don't in a lot of ways. And so in the beginning, it kind of felt like much of my energy was on figuring out how this virus works and making sure the public understands that. Now, like the majority of my audience is the US, right? So I was kind of, if anything, communicating this information to English speakers before they were very concerned about it. There were a lot of things, like there was confusion over the incubation period of the virus, what kind of symptoms are shown in the virus, the efficacy of face masks, which, as we all know, there's been a total 180 on that narrative in the United States. I feel like, you know, one of my contributions was I'm the first person that I noticed talking about autoimmune diseases very, very early on. Other health risks that were coming out of China. So for instance, if you have cardiovascular disease or high blood pressure, which is about half of the United States, your chance of fatality is much, much higher. It's quite alarming, actually. It's well over 10%. And so kind of warning Americans about this ahead of time, warning them about the fact that the virus often shows itself with gastrointestinal systems among young people, and not, you know, the cough and fever that was being touted by the major news media outlets. So I feel like we in South Korea were actually ahead of the US, and there was a lag for a period of time where I was seeing stuff coming out of the major networks in the US, and I was frustrated because I felt like that information is not up to date and is actually doing a disservice to people. Then there, you know, came the period where South Korea kind of overcame the worst of the coronavirus, and the United States started to get a little jealous, right? Like that's the feeling that I'm getting from the emails I get from people on Twitter. There's been so much engagement during this period of time on social media, and I've just been recording everything in my work, but also on my social media, from how there's like bottles of loose hand sanitizer in every subway station to, you know, how easy it is to get a test and how little it costs. This has really generated a conversation about healthcare in South Korea versus the United States as well. And that continues to be something that I harp on, and it's been something I've been harping on for a while, to be honest. And so I guess, you know, as someone who's kind of between these two countries culturally, it's really interesting because at first this was seen as like an Asia problem, And then it turned into, you know, South Korea was put on this pedestal for what the United States should have done or should look like. Granted that, you know, like these two countries experienced their first casualties and cases around the same time. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
No, it really does. And I think it is so important, that sense that you're an early warning system, as you put it. You know, it's like you, in doing your work, you help the world understand where this is headed and where it's going. It's such important work, and you brought a lot of precision to it. And I admire the work you've been doing. And when we come back, I want to talk about the future of freelancing and how that's going to work, and how do emerging journalists really get rolling? How hard is that? But before we do, I want to go around the horn again and say, Letícia, your reporting in Brazil for Democracy Undone really confronted that front line of cyber attacks. And it is a really disturbing and distressing form of violence, the way we're watching these mostly right-wing and sort of populist nationalist movements creating armies of trolls that come after people, or just hate speech that comes at anyone who dares to sort of question some of their leadership. You saw this with this character Olavo, who you brought into our world, who we didn't know about. But just to give all of you who don't know, Olavo is like he's the Steve Bannon of Brazil, and he lives in Virginia, which interests me, sort of in the shadows of the CIA. And he is out there on this kind of beat up house in the country road. And he is, from that house, he is putting out the ideology of Bolsonaro's emerging nationalist movement in Brazil. And how many followers does he have?
It's almost 1 million.
He's just literally got this army of followers who are watching his speeches at his desk, and he's preaching to them. And Letícia had this great idea to look at that in terms of, this is like the brain matter of a nationalist movement. So how could you confront it? How could you go at it? And Letícia, I want you to just talk a little bit about how you did that. It was tremendous courage. It was a different kind of front line. One of the real perils of these cyber attacks is they are increasingly targeting women. This is particularly tough for women foreign correspondents or women journalists. It's something we need to really be sure you're braced for and prepared for. And I think we did a pretty good job of getting you ready for that interview, in the sense that you had all the knowledge, and I hope you felt supported there, because it was pretty ugly. But tell us how that unfolded. What did you find, and how did Olavo treat you?
Well, so Olavo is such a character. It's hard to explain if you guys never heard about him, because he's really aggressive, and he is like a YouTube star in Brazil. So all these right-wing people, especially young people, they love him, and he's like an idol. And he's like this old guy, very aggressive, and he used all bad words. And often he releases videos on YouTube, tries to humiliating journalists. So he records all his interviews, and then he disputes everything. So when an interview was published, he basically goes there and say, oh, the journalists had changed everything. So it's a strategy. Attacking the press is really something he does very personally. And when I went there, I knew that. So I tried to prepare, and having all my interviews based on something he had written or said on YouTube. So all my questions are really based on what he said. I was really prepared, because he tries to portray journalists as stupid people. So usually when you ask a question, he would say to you, oh, you never read my books. So I read the books, and I would say, wow, I read. And what do you read? And then I would say, wow, I read that. And he was trying all the time, inviting me to like a fight, because he was trying to just putting me as like in a hot spot and say like I'm stupid. But I was really calm and and prepared. So I was answering the questions and making my questions. And so first time I went there was a little before I got the fellowship. So I spent 6 hours there with him, and I listened to him. And then I wrote, was part of my thesis for Columbia University. I wrote on how the far right in Brazil were rewriting history. And then when I got the fellowship, we said, oh, let's come back there and do a second interview and record him in English, if possible, and update the interview. And then when I went there, he was really, really, really aggressive with me. And first he was avoiding the second interview. And then I just went there. Charlie insisted on me, oh, just let's go there and let's just knock the door. I was trying for 4 months, and he was never answering my calls for the second interview. And when I went there, finally, I had a chance to speak with him. And then he had read the piece I have written. And then he started like attacking me in all bad words you can imagine. He was screaming, he was punching his desk, and he was calling me a slut, a liar, a prostitute, everything you can imagine. You imagine all bad words you can think about. He called me, and he was screaming at me, and he was just like waving his finger, and was very intimidating. And all his family was watching. They are sitting in a couch behind me and watching, eating Burger Kings and smoking cigarettes. And I was part of like a show. So he was recording me. He had his camera on me, on my face, and he was doing this all show to invite me for this fight. So it was something that was difficult to be there. Just try to think, how could I keep asking questions and just doing my work as journalist, and try to understand how these attacks were not personal, really attacks, but part of this playbook. So I wrote the piece, and I think just to connect a little bit I think that's really important to understand how this playbook works, because he tries to attack journalists as part of the strategy to like destroy the media, to put the media as the enemy. And right now with all the corona crisis, what he's doing, he's attacking the World Health Organization. So he's saying like, oh, Brazilians don't believe them. Everything they say is bullshit. And he say the World Health Organization is like a international global organ of enslavement. And he say that they want to take out the freedom, to restrict the freedom of the people, and the Brazilians should not believe the authorities, the scientists. So I think it's really crucial for us to understand how this ideology works, and how guys like him, of course, he's just an example. We have like a global phenomenon on this, but studying this ideology, how they work and how they operate, how they manipulate the narrative, I think is really crucial, because these policies are, as I mentioned before, the policies are killing people.
Thanks, Letícia. And just so everybody knows, first of all, you did have a colleague with you. I was happy that Mitch was there with you as a producer, even though he doesn't speak Portuguese. So all he could feel was the hostility, but he didn't know exactly what was being said. But when we got the translations, it was some of the most coarse and hostile and violent language I've ever heard recorded. I mean, it was just, I've just never heard anything like it. It was so personal and attacking and hurtful. And the way you handled that was the kind of courage that really matters. Like Selin navigating a front line, learning from Dexter, you navigating a front line, and the courage that you showed and the preparedness you did made the reporting really important. So Leticia's piece ran in the Atlantic magazine. It was also in our podcast, and I'd love you to listen to the podcast if you can. The GroundTruth podcast on Democracy Undone features Leticia's reporting, and you can hear that conversation, which we
the fights there, like, yeah.
We recorded it and we ran it. And PRI, the World Public Radio International on National Public Radio also presented that and really allowed her to confront that kind of tyranny. So really great job and good work. Selin and Kelly, we're gonna run out of time if we don't go through these super quick. So I'm gonna ask quick questions and ask you to do quick answers. and then we're going to get right to your questions and try to stay on track. Selin, I wanted to ask you about one of the things about this global pandemic is that it's really revealing inequities in our own country, and in every corner of our communities, we're seeing this. We're seeing that, the high rate among African American and Hispanic populations, but also migrant workers, the homeless. They are the most vulnerable, and they are also the most severely impacted by this. You're editing the essays of our Report for America Corps members from every corner of the country. And maybe just share with us a headline or two of one that you think, just a couple stories that really get at that notion of the inequity that rises to the surface during the pandemic.
Well, yes, like you say, there are so great many examples, and they are tough to read, and they come across our desk daily as we do an RFA COVID roundup and send it out as a newsletter that covers what all of our Corps members across the country are doing on a daily basis, the stories, the impact, and the opportunity to read more of their work. And as these stories have come across our desks at GroundTruth, I think the ones that have struck me are the ones that they are only stories that can be done by either being there in person or by having worked in this community for long enough and gained the trust of enough sources that you can report on such a delicate situation as, say, one of our reporters, Megan Taros, who's in Idaho reporting on domestic violence, and she covers the Latinx community there, is an example of someone who had the sources and was on the ground for so much of her reporting year that she was able to cover this incredible story of domestic violence from a distance, from a safe distance, but also sometimes having to go right into the field, and it's that risk reward question again. It's how close do I have to get, and how important is it to give voice to these most vulnerable people who are down and out more than ever, and they are struggling for basic needs and basic resources, and we're the only tether that they have, and how do I make sure that I don't put them at undue risk by covering that story? And so I've been working with our reporters to do that, and most of them are staying remote. Most of them are only going out if it's absolutely necessary, and I think that that's kind of how we're approaching all of these stories is, how much voice can you get from these communities from a distance, and then if you have to go into the homeless shelter just to see it for yourself, to verify what we're reporting on. If you have to go into the domestic abuse shelter, if you have to go into the farmer's barn and see him slaughter his sheep, these types of images are they're crucial to actually getting people to care about the story. So it's a balance. It's a delicate balance. But the work that we've put out, that our Corps members are doing, you can follow every day on our RFA newsletter, and it will send you the stories across the country that they're covering, and it is quite a roundup, I will tell you. It's something that's worth following, because it is a true tab of what's going on across our country.
I love what you said about the stories. They're the stories that are the kinds of stories that are the only ones you can get when you're there on the ground, when you're really in the community and with people. That's the sacred role of GroundTruth. And that is so important right now when it's these really vulnerable communities that need their stories told. So it's great work. I'd love all of you to to really dive in on that in our newsletter, and you can see all the pieces that Selin's editing and the amazing work of the Report for America Core members. Kelly, last question from me, and then we're going to have some from others, is basically about the future of freelancing. I think you're in a tough spot in the sense that you're navigating a career trying to share stories from South Korea that are complex, big stories, and yet the whole world is just, understandably perhaps, but just completely glued to this pandemic. And it's like, when do we step back? How do we step back? And when we do finally do that, what does the landscape for foreign news look like to you? What are the stories that need to be told, that you want to tell when we get to the other side of this?
You know, in the past week or two, I've been lucky enough to land some work that is not directly coronavirus related, but strategically, I always have to say something along the lines of, you know, this is the biggest story in South Korea right now, arguably more than coronavirus. And then of course that becomes the lead, right? It's tough because as a freelancer, like, I am my own business. And I have to think about everything from, you know, like the lens of whether or not this is profitable for my time, things like that, which kind of takes some of the love for journalism out of it at times. But, you know, I mean, we've had a lot of things going on in South Korea, which I have been covering. For instance, we had an election, which was a really big deal. It's the first time. My dog is barking in the background, so apologies. I can't make him stop. Just wanted to acknowledge it. But yeah, we just had a big election with a North Korean defector who was put into office in South Korea's National Assembly. The first ever feminist platform ran for a seat in the National Assembly. We have a major digital sex crime ring that was busted in South Korea that is changing laws and also speaks to a greater trend internationally. So these are definitely things I've been covering, but it's been a tough sell in the time of coronavirus. To answer your question about the landscape, I don't want to be too grim, but I'm very worried.
About freelancers specifically, and that, or international news in general?
Both. I mean, I think international news, the quality may go down because, you know, at least for South Korea, the majority of foreign correspondence coming out of here comes from freelancers. Staff jobs are extremely rare, and I can probably name 5 staff reporters off the top of my head, but dozens and dozens and dozens of freelance journalists. And so when, you know, the budgets decrease and the commissions decrease, you have freelancers being forced to work faster to make up that income and also potentially, you know, compromise their work or their morals. And so every day you have to wake up and make this decision that, you know, you're going to stand by your journalistic values more than your income and your pocketbook, which is always an increasing challenge. Just to give you some like data, I feel like this is anecdotal, but since I started here 3 years ago, the rate per piece has gone down anywhere from 30 to 60%. And it has certainly gone down in pretty much every single organization that I have worked with. And the other problem is collecting your money. I just did an audit on my income for the last 18 months, and I'm still like 25% unpaid. So this is the state of foreign correspondence right now, is that we are working for less and less pay for honestly more and more work, and we're not getting paid on time. And then just to tie it to coronavirus, there's also the question of, you know, safety and protection and things like that. I've been asked to go to hospitals in outbreak hotspots for no additional pay, already kind of a sad rate, no protections, things like that. And I had to make the call that my health is more important. And not every single journalist here has been able to do that or has done that. And so I think it becomes difficult because we have to make these moral and business decisions, and that takes up a lot of our brain capacity. And then we also have to do our work. because the public needs it. So the answer is money. How that is obtained for foreign correspondents, I don't know. Yeah.
You know, thanks, Kelly. And it's never been easy, but it's getting harder and harder. And it's a real challenge. It's something that I hope GroundTruth can play a role in. We try to support, you know, journalists through the fellowship model and give them a little extra support to try to do this work. One of the great contributions Kelly gave to us was Navigator, which is a newsletter to try to help journalists learn how to navigate this terrain. And so we are forever grateful to you, Kelly, for getting that started and getting it rolling. And I hope it continues to provide good information and advice to journalists, but it's a really hard time to navigate this. And I think safety always first, whether you're in the Middle East or you're covering a pandemic. And GroundTruth's part of something called ACOS, a culture of safety, and we're really proud to have been one of the founders of that organization, at least one of the founding members of that organization. And it's really a time for freelancers to bind together and stick up for each other, and GroundTruth's always tried to place ourselves on the side of the freelancers. So I hope you continue to do great work. I wish I could say I was more positive about the economy turning on it. But speaking of economy, you have to get to work at do you have a deadline today or something? Michael is saying you might need to leave at 7:15, no later, correct?
B?
Yeah. Am I reading?
I cleared my schedule. I mean, it's almost 8 a.m., but I'm here until the end.
I had 7. Okay. I had a note here that you might need to leave in about 15 minutes. But
and if I can just add, Charlie, I do exactly in the era of coronavirus and the impact on the U.S. economy, this will have a chilling effect on foreign correspondents. Yep. I've already seen 3 clients drop all foreign correspondents since the coronavirus pandemic started. And they did confide to me that they're worried about a recession. So these are real chilling effects for the quality of information that everyone else is going to get.
It's a theme. I mean, the economics of journalism are becoming part of the reason it's so hard to do it. Like for local reporters, it's hard to get a job. That's why Report for America is trying to come in with this funding model to help them. For freelancers, really hard. That's why Kevin and Wilson and the team do these amazing fellowships to try to provide a little infusion of the support and the training and the mentoring and editing you need to really make it happen. So keep up the good fight. I want to get to some questions. Sig, you had a really good question about Frontlines and just sort of taking care of yourself. How do we do this, Michael? Should I read the question or should we just?
So I was going to read the 2 questions that we have that I would like us to get to first.
Okay, go for it. Thank you.
First one being, I'm wondering what institutional or public support GroundTruth reporters are getting as they face violence online and in person. Are the reporters on their own to fight their battles?
I can probably answer that one most efficiently. And I would say the way the GroundTruth model works is we fund fellowships for somewhere between 2 and 6 months. And Kevin, I think, is still with us, right? So Kev, you can jump in here if I miss anything or if you hear something you want to add to, but Kevin runs our fellowships, and that model is really designed to be an infusion of cash. So for example, we supported Letícia for, was it about 3 months to do this reporting? It ended up being longer, but we end up kind of giving freelancers time to do other things along the way. Letícia, we tried to be there to support you in terms of training and also just offer the practical support of funding to get this work done. Did the model work for you? Are you know, I don't want to put you on the spot. You can share, but we certainly paid attention to training and teamwork, team building. Did it work?
I think you're muted, Letícia.
I really appreciate, I think, the way the GroundTruth works. I really appreciate the kind of open communication we have, and we can kind of building together the solutions as we are going through. And according to the new things we're facing during the reporting, I think we have a very good exchange and finding the solutions together. And always when I have a question, I would discuss with the team and we will discuss together, and also shaping the project in a way that I'm really proud of it with the results we have. And I think is not that common in other news organizations I've worked with, having such an open and good teamwork and communication. I think that worked for me.
I would just add super quickly that I think our philosophy is that nobody is ever on their own. And that's during the time of their fellowship while they're working with us, and then beyond. We have this very good habit of staying in touch with our alums for years, including some of the folks on this call. So I think we know that this is a global community, it's a global network, and we have to watch out for one another. And so that's what we'll continue to do.
And I think we have time for one more question, which is the one Sig sent in. What are you on the front lines doing to take care of yourselves? I worry about PTSD in the context of sadness, horror, and uncertainty, and hope you are finding ways to take care of yourselves.
Yeah, I think it might be interesting to ask some of the reporters this, but I know we really care about sort of emotional self-care. We think a lot about a reporter version of PTSD. We work with something called the DART Center on Trauma, which is based at Columbia University. We try to connect those resources to our reporters in the field who might need them. But it's hard to know when a reporter needs it. You know, it's not in a reporter's instincts really to complain too much, except to editors. Like kind of in the big picture, they tend to want to tough it out. But any of you want to share anything? Have you seen this? Have you felt it? I mean, this is incredibly traumatic to be reporting a story where there's so much, you know, there's really a lot of death. There's really a lot of trauma for the families you're covering. Selin, I think you might have touched on some of that, or do you have any thoughts that way?
Yeah, I think it's different for everybody, of course, and every story is circumstantial. But a couple of the things that I've seen across our core, our Report for America core, and you know, across the journalism community online and on social media, has been to just carve out time to really put everything away and be at peace, doing whatever it is that gives you that. And then, you know, to kind of touch on Joanne's follow-up question here, I've been really active in telling the reporters to really think about the impact that they're having, and to reporters, not only do they not tend to complain, but they tend to downplay the importance of their work. And so just noting the impact that it's having to give voice to these stories and the people in their communities, that's a very important component. And the support network of journalists, you know, sharing those things has been a really incredible, it's been really incredible to see what a difference that can make in picking you up and getting you back out there, or, you know, just, you know, I'm thinking of Kelly's piece. It's the first thing in my mind. She did a piece for GroundTruth about, you know, being safe as a reporter going out there covering COVID. And there was just an incredible response on social media as a result. And I think people are looking for that and depending on that network of journalism and of resources more than ever. And sharing these stories has been kind of the strongest antidote, for lack of a better word, to the trials and tribulations of covering COVID.
I want to, I really want to just give a pause here to say it is 7 o'clock. We want to stay on time. We want to let people who might have a hard deadline. Michael, just give me a nod if that's the right thing to say right now. I don't want to.
I think if we just let Letícia and Kelly also answer that question, and then we can wrap it up on sort of like an uplifting, I eat ice cream, maybe I pet my dog note, and then call it a night.
Okay. I think if you have time, please stay. And I would love to hear both Letícia and Kelly respond to that question about emotional self-care and just how you deal with physical care on these assignments. But if you do have to go, the purpose here was to really be sure we said thank you to you. So anyone who does need to leave, we understand. and just know how appreciative we are that you came, but also how appreciative we are for your support. And I'll circle back to talk a little bit about some of the silver linings that exist here inside of the dark cloud of COVID. But Kelly, do you want to take a shot at that? And then Letícia, you can close it out.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I've suffered from PTSD from reporting, but I've definitely lost a lot of sleep over some of the things that I've covered, particularly with COVID, but also with North Korean defectors and other people who have survived some pretty awful things. And, you know, I find as a freelancer, speaking with my editor, that's just not the space to resolve that, because quite frankly, as a freelancer, my concern is to be easy to work with so that I keep getting work. And what's been interesting is places like GroundTruth have kind of served as like a space for me to write out those thoughts. GroundTruth is a place I know to go when I want to write a piece that is reflective about what it's like covering these kinds of things. And just on a personal note, I mean, I feel that a lot of the other freelance foreign correspondents in Korea, we all really lean on each other. We have group chats, we meet up for beers, we have one-to-one conversations because we're all often going through the same things. And it's just on a personal level, also just normal self-care, things like taking up jogging, adopting a cat, and carving out space to not work and just to take care of yourself, because I feel like freelancers always think of time as money. Time that they spend resting is time that they're not spending making money. Every single time someone calls me to do a TV hit or something, I drop everything, because who knows when that work is going to come again. You never know how much you're going to make at the end of the month. And again, when I say it's like running your life as a business, it really is. You have to kind of choose your benefits and your values, and like where you draw the line between work and life, and when it's okay to say no, and let those opportunities slide or disappear for the time being. So yeah, I think it takes effort. You have to have a concerted effort and thought process about how to keep yourself in this work, because it is exhausting and it does cause burnout for sure.
Letícia?
I'd like to answer the Joanne's question about how the subjects of our journalism and communities are receiving our stories in the press.
Okay.
I think that's really an important topic. And it seems to me that the big problem we have right now is this polarization in society. So we have certain communities where they love us, they love the press, and they really feel our work's crucial for them. But at the same time, we have certain communities where it's harder and harder to get into and to have a dialogue with them, because especially here in the West, probably would be people just watching Fox News all the time, or just receiving this fake news. So it's really difficult to get inside these ghettos. It's like they are really close, and they just bought this idea that the press is the enemy. And so I think in these communities it's really hard to report on. And that's, for example, in Brazil, these people who are organizing these protests on supporting Bolsonaro, they have WhatsApp groups, and they call this a war. They say, they invite the people, they say, now you are not a common citizen anymore. Now you are like a soldier. And you have to go to the protest with using certain kind of clothes, comfortable clothes, to be ready for fight. So these physical attacks on journalists are part of the strategy. And they are going to the protest with this spirit of fighting. And it's really scary, because I feel that's something growing. And of course, now they're just a small group, very extreme, but I don't know how big they can become. And that's something that scares me. That scares me much more than ever other topic right now, thinking about how this fake news and these authoritarian agendas are just growing in our societies, something that before we thought, oh, that's just like on the fringe, it's just a small group, and now they're growing. And they're using the pandemic, weaponizing the pandemic, and that's really threatening to me. But of course, I think yet from the most of communities, they recognize our work and they're very thankful. And I think that's really important. We have to keep working, but it's not easy. And this polarization we're seeing is just growing. And that's something we have to think about, how to keep the social dialogue with this, even covering these communities too.
Thanks, Letícia, and great question, Joanne. And we're down to a few, and I can actually say, Sig and Susan, thanks for joining us, and Kat, thank you so much for being here. I think about Marie all the time on these new front lines and how she'd be inspiring this new generation to do it. This Kat is Marie Colvin's sister, and Marie was one of my favorite people on this planet to go be on a night with. So I had more laughs with her, and I'm so sad she's not with us, but she was truly one of the greats. And my brother Rob, thanks, and Joanne, thanks for a great question. So Michael, we're down to a small group. I'll close out saying this, that this was extraordinary, and thank you for helping us pull it together. Thank you for being here. And most of all, what a chance for you to see some of the work we do every day. Like, this is what we're trying to do, is to say, please know we're so appreciative of your support, but we really want you to know the work's extraordinary. So Michael, I don't know if I can talk about how much we all sort of love our pets and these things like ice cream, or maybe getting together online. There are little tiny thin bands of light that come through the dark cloud of the COVID-19 crisis. But for me, a absolute bolt of sunshine that comes through COVID-19 is the work this generation of journalists are doing. They are completely committed to the craft and to the service. So every day, last night, in addition to these three, if you can imagine, last night we had 200 reporters on a conference call, all about to go off to their assignments on June 1st, and we were kind of welcoming them. And people who were on the call know what I'm talking about. It was absolutely heartwarming to see their faces and how psyched they were to go off to do this work. And there was this one moment when we were just about to close it out, and they all just started saying these goodbyes and sort of thank you, and we can't wait to get to work. And they were saying all these messages that were so hopeful and so positive, and it was like flickering fireflies of hope all over this field of screen as they kind of signed off and went off to think about their training and what they're going to do with Report for America. It was one of the most magical moments I've had in 9 years of doing GroundTruth. This is really becoming a movement of a new generation of journalists who are deeply committed. And I just want to thank everyone on this call, for the reporters especially. Here's to you guys.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie, for putting it together. It's so inspiring. You're just amazing, all of you. It's so important what you're doing.
Thanks,
Kat. I do appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah.
And
Thank you guys so much for being here.
thanks. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you,
bye.
everyone.
Take care. Have a great evening.
Bye.